Hey everyone, welcome back to FPL Fran. Today's video is going to be the Gameweek 11 cheat sheet. I've just watched the Champions League fixtures for this week, and of course, there's still going to be Conference League fixtures to go tomorrow, and some other potential impacts in terms of injuries for certain players. But I think the wider macro picture for this game week, as we look ahead, is a lot of people do have a Gyökeres transfer to make. At the same time, I think it's a fixture window that's a little bit weird because there's a really good Chelsea game, and of course, the subsequent Chelsea game is quite good. But actually, the wider fixture run to maybe look at is probably a team like Liverpool's coming out of this Man City game in Game Week 11. So realistically, I think there's almost a certain amount of managers who probably are actually waiting to make potential Liverpool transfers next week and maybe even just wider, better fixture runs, right? For example, if you're investing into a team like Brighton, you probably don't want to do that this week versus Crystal Palace away. But instead, Game Week 12 is actually a really good opportunity to kind of look at that. At the same time, I think, as I said, if you have a Gyökeres transfer to make, probably snapping up that triple Arsenal spot as soon as possible using two free transfers, I think is worthwhile. So that's just something I wanted to mention. As far as what the cheat sheet is, it's effectively a tier list series of looking at all the FPL assets based on their price point, based on almost the quality that I hold these players to be, looking at their fixture run, not just these 3 games, but the wider picture, maybe let's say the next 5 to 7 games, keep taking into account that we'll also get these AFCON transfers in Game Week 16. On top of that, we're looking at things like my expected minutes, my understanding of tactics, and then also just underlying trends that we've seen so far, and even historical trends of players to sort of set our baselines. All of these come from and are supported by Fantasy Football Hub's OptaStats tool, which you can find within the link in the description below. I tend to actually look at this very, very often because, especially with DEFCON this season, I tend to think that DEFCON is almost a stat that actually is more widely impacted in terms of our expectations by actually what has happened this season as opposed to, let's say, previous season. So that's why I think, as I said, the OptaStats tool is just very helpful because you can actually see how well players have been doing almost as a matter of DEFCON per start or even DEFCON per 90. So let's just jump into the midfield this week. One thing I'll say within the midfield is there's still, for me, a lack of quality within that sort of sub 6 million position. There are players who've obviously gotten holes, like even Granit Xhaka, for example, Enzo Lefebvre has gotten involved recently. But I think that the key point to sort of make here is that I still think that this position is not one where you can plug and play every single week. Whereas there are certainly some players within the midfield position, as soon as you creep into that 6 million position, that are playable every single week. So that's kind of my overarching point here, coming out of a great Granit Xhaka haul and Enzo Lefebvre support. As far as that 4.9 tier, right? I think actually, and maybe we take a step back. I think in the 4.4 tier, we actually have a new addition, which would be Potts. I think this is a bit bold for me to call it now, but we are in search of players who almost fulfill the same role as, let's say, a Mark Yu or an Obi within the forward position. However, those players within the forward positions are still quite moot outside of Truppi Jr., right? They don't really provide almost a source of points additions or even good auto sub potential going forwards, whereas someone like Potts potentially could do that. I personally think that he's going to continue starting for this West Ham team. I mean, we've seen the Souček Irving experiment. I don't think it went particularly well. The result versus Newcastle was great. I think he put in a great performance, almost scored even and was caught offside. But the key thing is that he's potentially someone who could be just a regular midfielder who actually has good Seabrit just because of the position that he takes on the pitch. And then on top of that, ultimately, if he has some shred of, let's say, ability to just play in open play, he's going to have some value. So I quite like Potts from this perspective. He's probably the first midfield addition that we've had in a while that actually can present you with a consistent opportunity to get points. King has been sort of removed from the cheat sheet, even though I think King is very, very good, and a lot of people probably own him for the same purpose. I still kind of question, let's say, Fulham's attack, and then also investing into someone who's probably not a centre forward, so someone who's going to get the majority of the chances for that Fulham team. Whereas with Potts, you're probably saying actually the route towards points is just someone who's very, very cheap and could reasonably get DEFCON, maybe let's say 40-50% of the time. And I think that's actually really good. In the next tier, we have Lefebvre getting an addition. The main reason why I've actually added Lefebvre, and you can see over the recent weeks, I've actually almost, introduced Lefebvre into the cheat sheet, then actually given him a rise. The main addition for this is because I think at the start of the season, if you look at Lefebvre's minutes, they were very broken up. There were stop and starts. And now he's almost in a position where he's like a 74 to 90-minute player permanently. And I think we have enough confidence given the run of games and actually the performance of Sunderland and Lefebvre himself over this run to say that he's actually nailed again. So I would like to give him that boost because we do think that he's on penalty. So whilst he might not be, let's say, the same quality of player compared to Granit Xhaka when it comes to, let's say, that sort of DEFCON per 90 rate, I think the key thing is the penalty share could be quite interesting. And does rival, of course, what Granit Xhaka brings to the table with regards to, set pieces and things like that. Longstaff gets a drop because I think the Leeds fixture run just gets worse from here on out. Not really a huge reflection in terms of whether he's good or bad. I think just the Seabird rate isn't good enough, and I think Dewsbury Hall will probably suffer the same thing next week when you come out of a really good Fulham at home fixture. In the next position, I think Anderson, there's not really much to be said. I think he's a touch expensive for the price point, but then he still probably is the most reliable sort of producer of DEFCON outside of Caicedo. So there is value in doing that. And of course, if you have a little bit more confidence in this Nottingham Forest team going forwards, I think maybe even you can let's say presume that he could provide a little bit more attacking quality, because some of his attacking numbers outside of just pure underlyings have shot up the season. So as we can see, some of the XAG is a little bit better. At the same time, he's also just getting more shots off, and he's also getting a lot more passes. So that volume of pass could also even provide potentially bonus potential for him. In the next tier, I think it's quite dry, but there are a lot of differentials. And I think the key point to make here is that I don't think this is the most efficient allocation of funds, but I think these are picks that could work really well if you were to own them for what is a good fixture run. So for example, with Paqueta here, his fixture run is about to end, which is why I'm not going to give him a boost, even though he just scored a quote unquote screamer versus Nick Pope, which actually was just a Nick Pope mistake in my opinion. I don't think it's very much kind of like the goal versus Chelsea, where if you look at Paqueta's goals this season, I think has been more the onus being on goalkeepers not doing very well than Paqueta actually has become sort of Coutinho of old or something like that. So, Burnley at home is going to be a great game, but after that, the West Ham fixture run is absolutely diabolical. So I think that takes away a lot of the value from Paqueta. As far as Marino, he's been an addition. I think his sort of utility within the game is always going to be tied towards what exactly is going on with Gyökeres. What is the timeline for Havertz to come back? What is the timeline for even, Gyökeres to come back to full fitness? Because it's very likely if Gyökeres comes back post the international break, that Marino's role as a striker will probably be significantly reduced. Whereas in the short term, I think the value towards Marino is probably something like free hit potential and other things like that. With Yeremy Pino, who's been added, he's actually provided some really good sort of baselines when it comes to some of the attacking numbers that he's had within the Premier League. And I think the more enticing thing around him is actually that his minutes recently have absolutely shot up. However, the main and unfortunate thing is that he's going to be involved within European competitions as well. And so whilst I think players like Mateta and Sarr will be 90-minute players going forwards, I don't think you can say the same for someone like Yeremy Pino, who of course needs to be managed himself as a younger player. Jorginho has been added back into the cheat sheet as well. I mean, I clearly am a fan of Jorginho. He played 90 minutes last match versus Leeds, which in what I think was actually one of his best games of the season. So if you want to take that as almost like a sample size and project forwards, maybe his minutes could be a lot better now. But the concern with someone like Jorginho is always that I think occasional benching because the performances aren't good enough. And then on top of that, also just considering that someone who's actually playing on the edge of around 60 minutes, 65 minutes, and actually is prone to being subbed off because of that, especially if, let's say, someone like Matoma is to come back into the team, then you'll probably see someone like Diego Gomez's minutes probably be, let's say, shared across different positions as opposed to him sort of playing potentially on the left now. So that's something to look at for Jorginho. I don't think I'm that high on him, but Brighton are about to jump into a pretty good run of games coming out of this fixture. So just a player to add here, and maybe someone that, because a lot of people might be restricted from, let's say, spending, beyond 6 million. If you're looking for that one player who could still reasonably start, I think, quite a fair few games and is a bit cheaper than 6 million, then maybe Jorginho is that person. In the next tier, we actually have the 6 million players. I've added Turkey into this tier. I think the key thing to sort of mention with someone like Ryan Turkey is it's just the minutes and sort of the concern around how the minutes are going to be spread across multiple competitions. It seems like because Pep's focus in most times, I think, is always going to be prioritizing the league first and then potentially playing more kind of rotated squads within the Champions League at times. We saw, for example, that someone like Ryan Turkey came off the bench within the match recently versus Dortmund, and he even scored. But I think the key point is he had a great game in the last time out versus Bournemouth, and it's very likely that he's going to get a good share of Premier League minutes, but I think you can never be confident that he's going to be perpetually starting games. And potentially that also comes down to his own physical fitness and maybe, I guess, inability to stay on the pitch sometimes. So I've added him as a differential. I think if you're bold, you can go there, but you always know that this is a pick quite similar to, let's say, Savinho last season, who is favored and I think rated by the manager very much so. And I think he's much better than Savinho personally, but it doesn't necessarily mean that he's going to guarantee the minutes that you want for someone to produce consistent FPL points. in the next tier, and also I would just like to kind of close off in saying that I think Minte is absolutely the best sort of sub 6.1 million asset within the game. And I don't think it's particularly close just because his minutes are perfect and he does play for a reasonably strong top half kind of offensive team, at least if you look at underlying numbers. And he's just got a lot of value when you can kind of compare across all the other players here. It's only really Jeremy Pino who comes close in terms of underlyings, and even his minutes, I think, there's a little bit of doubt there. Plus, there's probably some error bars in terms of his own sample size, and maybe even lack of DEFCON compared to someone like Minte, who actually has gotten DEFCON at least once or twice this season. In the next tier, within the 6.5 pluses, I've actually given Rice an addition. I probably have to put my hands up here. I think the improvement in Rice this season has been quite massive. I think when you look at the underlying stats, it probably doesn't share the full picture of how good Rice has been. His numbers actually look exactly the same as last season, where he ended up with I think 4 goals, 7 assists season. And of course, did a little bit of overperformance, right? Even so far, I think when you look at, let's say, the goals, he probably should have only scored one. The goal, for example, within the previous match versus Burnley was arguably a screamer. I think the key thing with Rice, though, is that the set piece threat is there. The bonus aspect towards the set piece threat is there. And of course, it seems like there are now games where you're seeing a lot more defensive contribution sort of returns from Rice. And I think that average in terms of DEFCON per start or even per 90 has actually moved up game to game for me. Maybe this is also a symptom of, let's say, Odegaard not being a part of the team at present and Rice's role changing a little bit. So that, or maybe just indirectly as well, just the way that Arsenal have almost transformed their style a little bit too, and how that benefits Rice potentially. So I think that all kind of adds to Rice being much more multifaceted as a pick this year. As I said, I'll put my hands up that I probably didn't rate Rice appropriately, and I think for the first time in FPL, I think he's a very serious pick. As far as the other players in this tier, I absolutely love Iliman Ndiaye. He was said to have actually have a cramp, which is actually why he was subbed off at 62 minutes within the previous game. I think that we can take Moyes to hopefully be telling the truth, but my concern is that the Everton fixture run is actually just generally bad. Like if you look past the Fulham at home game, it is poor. However, Ndiaye just has a lot of promising things. So if we go back to that sort of Minte discussion, he has all the routes towards points, just worse fixtures, but he's also on penalties. So that's a huge addition. That's something like someone even Minte doesn't have. But he's, of course, at a different price point as well. And some of his underlying numbers are, of course, a little bit worse compared to someone like Minte. But then I think that's massively offset by the fact that he's on penalties. So that's kind of my take in terms of Ndiaye. I think it's just fixture related as to why he's not green. For Sobo, I actually added him towards the cheat sheet last week because I'm very confident that he's going to be a good FPL pick just because of the sort of positional change piece and sort of I think the increased confidence in Bradley probably just means more minutes kind of center mid, sort of attacking mid positions, which just means more routes towards attacking returns in open play. And it seems like I don't think his sort of DEFCON share really changes too much between whether he plays right back or attacking mid or even, let's say, center mid. I think consistently he's actually just very good at producing DEFCON himself. So the fact that he's on almost all the set pieces now just means that he's a very good pick when you sort of top on what is a very, very good Liverpool fixture run. So it is a bit weird where we don't really have many open play attackers that I think we rate too highly for Liverpool now because of maybe, let's say, minutes issues or just simply sort of lack of production compared to the price point, right? And I think I'm referring to Salah there. So for me, Sobo is actually at a very intriguing price point where, as I said, with the DEFCON sort of added in as part of the piece of the pie, I think he's actually one of the best picks within the game starting Gameweek 12. Kudus seems to be someone who needs to sort of have his injury sort of situation ascertained. I don't really know exactly what's going on because he was precluded from the squad versus Copenhagen. So let's just see what goes on there. I think the main overarching point, though, is that we don't really rate the Spurs attack. And for that reason, I think even if you, let's say, own Kudus and you're actually looking forward for him to be fit, and whilst Man United at home is actually a pretty good game because I don't think United have actually proven to be a very good defense at all this season based on underlyings, based on what we've seen in terms of the goals that they've conceded, despite Lamens coming in and sort of, at least adding a boost towards this team in terms of confidence that they can actually, make saves and almost overperform that expected goals conceded. I just think Kudus is a bit dry as pick, to be quite honest. And when you top on that really poor fixture run, I'm not interested. Bruno G has actually been added to the cheat sheet himself. He's a very, very interesting pick within the game. He's kind of like Rice Light because I don't think he has the same sort of sets of tools. His DEFCON rate's probably a little bit lower, much less set pieces. He's purely open play threat, but he is sort of at a price point and sort of at a production level as an all-rounder where he is somewhat interesting, but nothing beyond that. In the next tier, I've actually given Eze a rise, Gakpo a drop, and Gordon a drop. So Eze's rise, I think, comes down to I'm still confident that actually this Arsenal team in open play actually looks really, really solid. So I think maybe it was unfair of me to sort of downrate Eze's minutes too much. But then we also saw within some previous games that Eze's minutes aren't perfect, right? There are opportunities where he can get subbed off. If you look at the Champions League, he can also be someone who's sitting on the bench. At the same time, he was also the only player within the previous game within the AFL Cup where he was starting. So I think his minutes are no much worse than sort of more rotatable attackers, but he is a consistent starter so far with Odegaard being out. And that's a positive. His underlying stats have not been impressive so far. So I think the main sort of reason that's holding him back is unfortunately there's just better other Arsenal picks to go for. So I think whilst Eze is interesting and maybe he works for a lot of managers who, I don't know, maybe don't want Rice, but actually at the same time can't afford Saka, he might be the player that you go for. But I still prefer players like Rice, players like Saka, and definitely, for example, triple Arsenal defense as an approach towards how to use the 3 slots for Arsenal. For Gakpo, he gets a drop. I think that the main reflection of this is just, unfortunately, if you can get benched for a game like Real Madrid, which I think, yes, maybe let's say Liverpool are still probably putting more priority over the Premier League games. And as a result, maybe you can probably even argue that, let's say, that's good for Gakpo's minutes for this weekend, right? But I think the key point that I'm trying to make here is that if he can get subbed off for a game like that, if he can get subbed off for a game like Everton, not subbed off, sorry, but actually not selected to start for those types of games, and he can obviously come off quite early into games, like let's say 60, 65 minutes, despite him playing really well for Liverpool this season, then I think that you have to kind of judge that quite harshly against him. So I'm not hugely fond of Gakpo right now, just purely down to minutes, because when you look at the underlying stats, they've been super impressive this season. And if you look at, for example, NPXGI numbers this season, he's kind of blown things away outside of someone like Mbeumo, who comes very close. Gordon gets a drop because of the injury that was suffered within the Champions League match. At the same time, the 45-minute substitution, I don't think I need to really say more than that. But a 45-minute substitution for, let's say, poor performance / fatigue is just not good enough in FPL. There are so many more picks in the game that provide you value, playing twice the minutes of someone like Gordon, and that's it. He might even be injured, so maybe we don't need to talk too much about Gordon. In the next few tiers, I really don't have too much to add. I think Foden's playing exceptionally well for Man City, and it could still be harsh, for me to say that he's a differential pick. I think come, let's say, next week or maybe more game week 13, I see Foden definitely as a yellow or even a green pick again. But the next few fixtures for Man City aren't particularly good. And at the same time, I still think that it is clearly a down year for Foden. Like, the underlying stats are just worse. And even though he's had some really good Champions League performances, I think you can actually apply that to a lot of players and maybe just even just come down to say that the Premier League is tougher at times. And so there's not too much to be sort of learned from taking in the better Champions League performances for certain players. Like, I think the same even applies to someone like Salah, if we kind of pay reference towards that Atletico Madrid game as an example. As far as the other players, if I was to sort of make a comment in terms of Saka, I think he's just extremely consistent if you look at his historical career. He has sort of shown gradual progression almost at every sort of age category of improving and sort of drifting up his underlying stats. He's had a bad season so far. I don't think there's like a need to sugarcoat this, but he has missed certain games. And at the same time, I think he is now with full pen share, at least for the next 2 matches, potentially 3+. And we don't know when Gyökeres is back for sure. But that's a positive for Saka. And you just kind of have to take that for what it is. I think he's an interesting option as well from a captaincy perspective week on week, even though Haaland probably just dispels the need for that. And when you look at, for example, let's say the chances within the Burnley game, I think that's a positive, right? So if you're kind of going to judge Saka for having poor performances from the underlying perspective this season, at least the Burnley game is a bit of a reversal of that. And I think you can trust the historicals in a player who is still very much even before prime age. So I feel like I have confidence in Saka, but I also appreciate that other people don't. Or other people might find that they prefer using, let's say, the value within Rice to actually do other things with their team. I just think also within a landscape where you don't have Palmer, where you don't have Salah, and a lot of people potentially don't even have Bruno, that maybe Saka is actually a good value sort of use type of pick within the game. And although the wider picture within the midfield this season has been that the defensive mids have been scoring goals, it's not actually the reason, and even though the wider picture for the season has been that the defensive midfielders have done really well for points, I think one thing to sort of dispel here is that it's not DEFCON that has made defensive mids broken this season. It's just simply the way that the goals have been scored. When you look at underlying stats, these defensive midfielders like a Caicedo, a Palhinha, for example, or some of the other sort of top leading points picks within the game, like Gravenberch, who've scored goals this season, who've gotten assists. Yes, they've produced these returns, but I think it's not like their underlying stats have dramatically changed from previous seasons where they actually just really were poor for returns. It's just happened to be the case that they've scored a lot of goals. And then conversely, a lot of the open play sort of attacking wingers that we tend to hold, with a lot of esteem within the game, like, I don't know, maybe Acuna with United, or even a Saka within Arsenal, as an example, or even Salah within Liverpool. Whilst their underlying stats, might have all dropped a little bit this season, they're still far and away better than the defensive mids, and they still haven't produced open play returns towards the levels of the defensive mid. So I think if you're kind of betting and looking forwards, take DEFCON out of the argument for a second. It's just simply been the case that a lot of the DMs have overperformed, and a lot of the open plays sort of attacking players just haven't. And I would still bet that underlying numbers tend to drive better results. And I think you can see that, for example, within the forward position very, very clearly in terms of underlying stats and how they lend towards points. This is an argument that I think I've made and I don't need to make all the time, but I think it's just if you were to apply a sense check this season, I don't think something has dramatically tactically changed within football this season where only defensive mids can score goals. I think if I was to, as I say, be a betting man, I would bet that you'd see more attacking returns from good attacking players like Saka, and that's sort of my vision of things. But you can disagree, as I said. So that's going to be the cheat sheet for the midfielders. Let's just quickly move towards the forwards. As far as Igor Jesus, I think he gets added just because of the sort of Wood injury situation. We're also starting to see decent minutes from him. My main concern is that within the game coming after the first European Conference leg, he only played 45 minutes, and then he played 72 or 77 minutes versus Man United. So the minutes look okay. There are some poor fixtures in there. I think I would only see Igor Jesus as a very, very differential attacking play. And you have to have a lot of confidence that he's going to be the sort of main man going forwards for Sean Dyche. So I'm not super sold on him, if I can be honest. I just think that at the same time, when you look at some of the other leagues within the other teams within the league that have players around this price point, the main drawback for me is the rotation in terms of minutes, for example, within the Burnley players and the underlying stats being poor. And the same goes for someone like Wilson Isidore. I think if I was to give credit towards Sunderland's attack, I think it's just the whole team collective in terms of they're quite similar towards a team like maybe Arsenal, but like very, very Arsenal light in the sense that they find ways to score goals through a lot of different avenues, mostly through set pieces. So they don't really leave many kind of, I guess, gambits unturned in the Premier League. Like they try to find all facets of ways to scoring goals. And unfortunately, that just doesn't mean that, let's say, they're a team that's geared towards creating, numerous returns or chances for their strikers. The goals come from sort of all different aspects. And I don't think Wilson Isidore, for example, is someone who benefits from that necessarily. So in the next tier, I think you have two great picks in Thiago and Welbeck. Nothing has changed there. In the tier after that, the only change has been to drop Waltermat and Sesko. Now, Waltermat actually has benefited very much so from the Gordon injury. If this Gordon injury could be medium to long term, this means penalties for more minutes, for more time for Waltermat. However, the reason why I've still dropped Waltermat is because I am reacting harshly, first of all, to the West Ham performance, but then second of all to what happened within the West Ham performance, the 45-minute substitution once again. For me, if you can get subbed off at 45 minutes for fatigue, quote unquote fatigue, which is what Eddie Howe explained that substitution to be for, and Osula is like the only contender, I think, for the minutes within the attacking position that Waltermat plays, then that's not very good for your minutes outlook. And at the same time, I think there is an overall reflection of Newcastle so far where they just haven't really been productive in terms of attack. Like, yes, Waltermat has had high XG chances, but a lot of them have come from kind of set pieces where he's benefited, I guess, from Gabriel falling down in a rare moment of Gabriel weakness this season. At the same time, in open play, like he's had some sort of interesting returns. He's taken a great penalty within the Champions League. But it's not like there's a huge volume of chances for someone like Waltermat. And I think the team is generally struggling to create. So that for me is the overall negative and why I've given Waltermat a drop down. Sesko as well. I feel like this team is very good as a collective, but it's not like a Sesko run team, right? It's not a team that's built towards getting Sesko chances. If anything, even within the set pieces, it's someone like Maguire, who I think is still out, who benefits a lot more. And then, of course, some of the other center backs, they're not crossing, for example, all across the game. Yes, of course, Cunha and Bruno tried dinks at times towards Sesko, but I still feel like in terms of how they're actually trying to score on teams, it is, as you can see, someone like Mbomo, when you look back at, let's say, the underlying stats of someone like Mbomo, who has benefited this season from the kind of structure that they have. Even someone like Amad Diallo gets a lot of attacking returns and sort of chances himself, compared to someone like Sesko, who, when you look at the XG for 90 compared to some of the other forwards here, and of course he doesn't really have that sort of value in terms of XAG, just isn't good enough for a player of this sort of price point. When you kind of look across the field towards someone like Thiago, it makes a bit more sense because you're paying 6.x for someone of that sort of quality. Gyökeres unfortunately gets a drop. It seems like he's going to be injured and out for at least the next 2 games, potentially, maybe at least 1 game for the bare minimum. So for me, I think that's just unfortunately a drop for Gyökeres. I think he had an exceptional game, to be honest, versus Burnley. And yes, of course, you can put the caveat there, which is versus Burnley. But yeah, I thought he had a really good game there. And there's not much to be said. It's just an unfortunate situation. So I think people just need to transfer out of Gyökeres. If you want to hold Gyökeres, I think it's viable. But you also run the risk of also not knowing how long Gyökeres is truly out for, because he could be back, but then he could be back on the bench in the Tottenham game at the same time. Probably the only uncertainty that I have around Gyökeres is that he's going to get some price drops potentially. And a lot of people are still going to make the transfers away from Gyökeres. So do you run the risk of sort of losing that sort of value yourself? In the defensive position, just to move over to that, because there's nothing to be said about Erling Haaland, I feel like this is the position that actually has moved the least. And I think part of this is symptomatically because of DEFCON, not AFCON. But I think DEFCON has sort of normalized defenders a bit more. So your fixture runs don't look as, red and green, or binary. I feel like it's more a landscape of, even for example, within, let's say, if I was to use Senesi as an example, who has basically just is about to come through what is a tougher fixture run for Bournemouth, right? He's going to play Aston Villa away this weekend, which is one of the tougher games. And then suddenly he's about to jump onto a great run. But even within this match here versus Aston Villa away, Senesi has a lot of value because he's very good at DEFCONs. And at the same time, you actually add this DEFCON value in the game and realize that actually that probably is better than sometimes the clean sheets of certain teams. Because when clean sheet rates are, let's say, 20%, 25% for some of the teams that are maybe, 4.5, 5 million defender worthy, and you actually compare to something like Senesi, who maybe has, let's say, a DEFCON rate of 70 to 80%, it's very close in terms of what the expected value of that is. And so Senesi and a lot of the DEFCONers are now able to bridge that value so easily. So that's kind of why I think when you compare to, let's say, the midfield and forward positions, that changes a lot more because of open play value, but then defenders don't. So the only changes that I would sort of reflect within the defenders this week is that Burn gets a drop because, of course, there's an uncertainty around potentially an injury within the Champions League match. We need to see what exactly is going on there. I've added Cho into this list. I think Cho has just been probably one of Newcastle's best defenders outside of, if you want to put Dan Burn up there, who obviously has a historic CV that just means that Eddie Howe will never bench him. But yeah, Cho has been very exceptional, and his DEFCON rate's high because he also doesn't really play out wide. And that's a huge plus for what is still going to be a good defensive team. Yes, Newcastle have lost clean sheets as of late. Yes, they've played poorly as of late as well. But I still think the defensive baselines are there. Outside of that, the reason why Chalobah doesn't get a rise is because I still think there's a small uncertainty in certain circumstances with a little bit more of Chelsea depth coming back in defense, where Chalobah might not be 100% guaranteed to start every single match. I could be wrong. I'm happy to put my hands up if I'm wrong about that, but that's kind of how I view Chalobah. Lacroix doesn't get a rise this week. I still think Guehi's just better. He's just proven to be such a menacing threat. Still getting bonus, for example, within the previous match. It is nice, and it is a positive, though, that you can see that the Lacroix defensive contribution numbers are very real, right? That they're better still than someone like Richards, and they're still better than someone like Guehi. But is that enough for me to say that he's kind of also a green pick? I'm not sure. Maybe it is, and maybe I'm sort of underrating a player that I own, and as a salty manager who just hasn't had too many Lacroix points. But if we move on, James for me gets a rise. I think he's had way too many minutes within the Premier League for us to sort of disregard James as a pick. These are 2 exceptional Chelsea games. He's on a lot of set pieces. Yes, of course, the Chelsea fixture run I think actually turns horrible anyways in 2 game weeks time. So maybe you don't really need to move towards James unless you really need a player who get gap fills for these 2 weeks. But that's sort of my thoughts on James. I think he's an exceptional pick, and that's a positive thing in FPL. More choices is better. Tarkowski does get a drop. I think the concern with Tarkowski is actually when I look at the underlying stats this season, my main concern is that his DEFCON numbers aren't, or these aren't even underlying stats, or maybe they're, I don't know, DEFCON stats. The DEFCON stats just aren't good enough in terms of, we thought Tarkowski was going to be a game breaker in the sense that him and Murillo, for example, based on last season's numbers, were exceptional players. And I think whilst DEFCON is proven this season to be very individual dominant. So, for example, there are clear standouts for certain teams, and these are all because the individuals are standouts themselves. So Tarkowski, for example, still, I think, reigns supreme over someone like Keane at this moment in time, but not by very much. However, you can see a huge gap between someone like Senesi and someone like Diakite, or even Senesi and, for example, a fullback. But what I would say, though, is the numbers with Tarkowski himself individually this season aren't good enough where I think he holds that 5.5 price well. Keane does exactly what he does, as it seems like, for the exact same price and is just better. So for me, I am more a fan of just simply going for Keane if you want to have an Everton defender, or just simply moving out of Tarkowski because the fixture run is drying out for this team. Konate is interesting, and I think I probably would actually give Konate a rise after the Man City game. His minutes look good. He doesn't seem like he's struggling from any sort of injury issues right now. The only concern with someone like Konate is, when he was playing poorly, I think earlier within the season, those earlier substitutions also just mean that you're going to take away from that sort of per 90 DEFCON value, right? Because you're just taking minutes away from a certain player. So let's just see whether that sort of holds true for future games, but I think he just seems like a very good pick. That could be quite interesting as a bit of a differential for someone who might need to just save a little bit of money from Virgil. Guardiola is not that interesting for me because the DEFCON numbers aren't good enough. And at the same time, I think if you were to actually look at this City team and just be honest and not think about, okay, what has Guardiola done historically for us as FPL managers? The reality is the only interesting defensive pick, given that many of their defenders don't do very good or fare very good in terms of DEFCON, is actually just going to be Nico O'Reilly. But Ryan Nuri is there. He's going to play minutes. He is going to go to AFCON, though. So maybe there's going to be a short fixture run where we have Nico O'Reilly. But I think the point here that I'm trying to make is that I don't think the City defense is that good. And at the same time, I'm not that impressed by Guardiola, unfortunately. In the next tier, I feel like it's fair to give Saliba a small rise. He does have the least attacking threat of all the Arsenal defenders. So whilst the value is there because he is a play, the argument's basically the same as Raya, right? If you think Raya is a solid pick, I guess Saliba is also a solid pick within the game. He's going to be more nailed than someone like Calafiori and Timber. However, this season he's really struggled with fitness. So we've seen a lot of 45-minute substitutions for Saliba, one way or another, whether it's him starting and coming on 45 minutes, coming off at 45 minutes, or him starting on the bench, coming back from an injury and then coming on at 45 minutes, which happened versus Newcastle, right, where he was needed, probably because Mosquera didn't have the greatest of performances in the first half within that match. But I think that the main thing for Saliba here is that we all are actively trying to spend or already have triple Arsenal in some form of way. I feel like he's more within that Eze category of, I'm not sure if he's the best standout pick for Arsenal. Like, I think you can always hold an argument for Rice, for Saka, for any sort of triple up of the defenders. But with Saliba, I think he's the odd one out in terms of the back four. And to touch back on Calafiori and Timber, yes, of course, White is around, and he's played, for example, in the EFL Cup. Hincapié is playing some minutes here and there. Miles Lewis-Skelly has, of course, come on as a sub, as has Hincapié. But I think that the key thing is I still see that this Arsenal team is probably going to try and maximize every single fixture within the league just so that they can actually win this league title. And I feel like that is not going to come at the expense of Calafiori or Timber. I feel like they're going to get starts. So that's kind of my bold take. I think, yes, of course, there's a chance potentially, maybe a 1 in 10 sort of game type of chance that can happen to Calafiori and Timber. But I feel like when you actually compare it to Saliba, the attacking threat of Calafiori and Timber actually just means that you can probably actually run that risk of losing that one Arsenal fixture. Personally, that's kind of how I see it. The issue might be that they could be rotated on, let's say, a very good game on paper. But then if I look back at, for example, even let's say the Burnley fixture they played. So would I be really concerned? No. In the goalkeeping position, the only change that I've made is actually to drop Lamens. I think the United defensive numbers are still really poor, and I just wanted to reflect that. Yes, of course, Lamens looks like a really good shot stopper. He's making a lot of saves per 90, but this is a 5 million goalkeeper, not a 4 million goalkeeper. And so, yeah, my bad probably on sort of upping Lamens a little bit too fast. Otherwise, I wish you guys the best of luck within the cheat sheet this week. In terms of, let's say, the sort of wider picture within FPL, as I said, I think this week it is one where you probably find that triple up of Arsenal if you need to redistribute your funds, or probably practice patience because, as I said, there's a lot of good fixture runs ahead in Gameweek 12, and I'll see you guys there on the Gameweek 12 cheat sheet. So thank you guys once again, and I'll see you soon.